300,000 kilometers of paved roads. That was the size of the network that cut through mountains, crossed deserts, and connected 3 continents under a single flag. Rome built this system to move legions and collect taxes. It did not imagine that those same stones would carry apostles, that those ports would transport sacred scrolls, that common language would allow a fisherman from Galilee to be read in Rome, Athens, and Alexandria. The empire that crucified the Messiah ended up paving the way for his message to reach the entire world. To understand how this happened, you must go back more than 6 decades before the birth of Jesus. The year was 63 before Christ. General Pompey, one of the most powerful men in Rome, had just conquered Syria and was looking south. Judea was plunged into a civil war between 2 brothers of the Maccabean dynasty, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, who were disputing the throne and the high priesthood. Both made the same fatal mistake. They asked Rome for help. Pompey chose to support Hyrcanus. Aristobulus resisted, and so the legions marched upon Jerusalem. Before we begin, write in the comments from where you are watching. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. We continue. The siege lasted 3 months. 12,000 Jews died defending the Temple Mount. The Roman soldiers took advantage of the Sabbath when the defenders refused to fight offensively to build assault ramps. When they finally breached the walls, blood flowed through the sacred courts. Priests were killed while offering sacrifices. They did not stop even before the altar. Pompey did something that no pagan had done before. He entered the Holy of Holies. This was the most sacred precinct in the universe for the Jews. A perfect cube of 9 meters on each side, separated by a thick veil, where only the high priest could enter once a year, on the Day of Atonement. Inside, according to tradition, the Ark of the Covenant had rested. Pompey crossed the veil, looked around, and found the room completely empty. There were no images, there were no idols, there was no gold, only the space where the presence of God dwelt. The Roman general left without touching anything. He did not steal the treasures of the temple. He did not profane the sacred objects. Historians still debate why he acted this way, but the damage was already done. The sovereignty of Israel had ended. From that moment on, the Promised Land would answer to Rome. Think about what this meant for a people who considered themselves chosen by God. For centuries, the Jews had fought against Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and Greeks. They had been exiled and had returned. They had regained their independence under the Maccabees only 80 years earlier, and now, once again, a foreign empire controlled their destiny. The prophets had promised a Messiah who would liberate Israel. But liberation did not come. Instead, came the Roman eagle. Rome did not rule directly at first. It preferred to use client kings, local rulers who maintained order in exchange for limited autonomy. And that is how one of the most complex characters in biblical history emerged: Herod. He was not a Jew by blood. He was an Idumean, a descendant of the Edomites whom the Maccabees had forcibly converted decades earlier. His father, Antipater, had become an advisor to Hyrcanus and an ally of Rome. When Roman politics fragmented into civil wars, Herod navigated between the powers with impressive skill. He supported first Pompey, then Julius Caesar, then Cassius, then Mark Antony, and finally Octavian, who would become the Emperor Augustus. Every time the wind changed, Herod changed with it. In 37 before Christ, Rome declared him King of the Jews. Herod reigned for 33 years, and during that time he transformed Judea in a way that no one had done before. He built palaces at Masada, fortresses at Herodium, entire cities like Caesarea Maritima, with an artificial port, theatre, hippodrome, and a temple dedicated to Augustus. Caesarea took 12 years to complete and became one of the largest ports in the eastern Mediterranean, capable of receiving ships of 400 tons, but his most impressive work was the reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. The Second Temple, erected by the Jews who returned from the Babylonian exile, was modest compared to the glory of Solomon's temple. Herod decided to change it. He could not simply demolish the sanctuary, so he developed an ingenious plan. He would expand the platform of the Temple Mount, doubling its area, and rebuild the edifice piece by piece, without ever interrupting the daily sacrifices. The project began in 19 before Christ. 10,000 workers were hired. 1,000 priests were trained as masons to work in the most sacred areas where laypeople could not enter. Monumental stones were cut and transported, some weighing more than 500 tons, the equivalent of 100 African elephants. The retaining walls rose to more than 30 meters in height. The main sanctuary was clad in gold and white marble, shining under the sun in such a way that, according to the historian Josephus, it was impossible to look directly at it at midday. Herod died in 4 before Christ, but the works continued for decades. The temple was only completely finished in 64 after Christ, 6 years before being destroyed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the destruction, something much more significant happened in that setting, prepared by Rome and by Herod. The Messiah was born. The Gospel of Luke records that in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census was the first taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Each person was to go to his own city to be registered. Observe what is happening here. The most powerful emperor in the world, sitting in his palace in Rome, signs an administrative document. His intention is purely practical, to count the population to collect taxes more efficiently. He does not know that there is a prophecy in Micah, written 700 years earlier, saying that from Bethlehem would come the one who would be ruler in Israel. He does not know that a carpenter named Joseph, of the lineage of David, will have to travel 150 kilometers from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of this decree. He does not know that a pregnant young woman will make this journey and give birth in a stable because there was no room in the inn. Augustus was merely administering his empire. God was fulfilling his word. This is the dynamic that runs through the entire relationship between Rome and sacred history. The Romans acted out of political, military, and economic interests. They had not the slightest idea that they were executing a script written centuries before. They were unconscious actors in a cosmic drama. Herod also had his role. When the Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, asking where the King of the Jews had been born, the old monarch was troubled. He consulted the priests, discovered the prophecy about Bethlehem, and sent the Magi there with instructions to return and inform him about the child. His intention was to eliminate any rival. The Magi were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. Joseph also received a warning and fled with Mary and the boy to Egypt. Herod, furious, ordered the death of all children in Bethlehem under 2 years of age. The massacre of the innocents. Historians debate the numbers. Bethlehem was a small village, perhaps with a population of 300 to 1,000 people. The number of boys in that age group may have been between 6 and 20. It seems like little compared to the atrocities Herod committed against his own family, killing 3 sons and a wife on suspicion of treason. But each of those children was a universe. Each mother who wept in Ramah fulfilled, without knowing it, the words of Jeremiah. Rome created Herod, and Herod created the conditions for the first attempt to kill the Messiah to take place. After Herod's death, his kingdom was divided among 3 sons. Archelaus received Judea, but ruled so poorly that the Jews themselves asked Rome to remove him. In 6 after Christ, Augustus granted the request and transformed Judea into a Roman province, ruled directly by prefects sent from Rome. One of those prefects was Pontius Pilate. He ruled Judea for 10 years, from 26 to 36 after Christ. The Roman historians Tacitus and Josephus describe him as cruel and insensitive to Jewish customs. Early in his mandate, he provoked riots by bringing military standards with images of the emperor into Jerusalem, something the Jews considered idolatry. On another occasion, he used money from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct, causing protests that he repressed with violence, killing many. It was this man who sat on the judgment seat when Jesus of Nazareth was brought before him. The trial of Jesus involved 3 different legal systems. First, the Jewish Sanhedrin condemned him for blasphemy, a crime deserving of death according to Mosaic law. But the Jews under Roman rule did not have the authority to carry out capital punishment. They needed the governor's approval. Therefore they took Jesus to Pilate. Pilate interrogated the accused and found no crime according to Roman law. Jesus had not incited rebellion, had not withheld taxes, had not attacked soldiers. The prefect tried to release him, offering the traditional Passover amnesty. But the crowd, instigated by the religious leaders, chose Barabbas. Pilate washed his hands, literally, a theatrical gesture to exempt himself from responsibility for the blood of an innocent man. And then he delivered Jesus to be crucified. Crucifixion was the Roman method of execution reserved for slaves, traitors, and the worst criminals. It was designed to maximize pain and humiliation. The victim was stripped, scourged until their back was raw flesh, forced to carry the horizontal beam to the execution site, nailed or tied to the cross, and left to die slowly of asphyxiation, dehydration, or shock. Jesus was crucified on a Friday, probably on the 3rd of April in the year 33, although some datings suggest the year 30. Above his head, Pilate ordered a sign to be placed in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, saying, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The priests protested, asking that the inscription be changed to, "This man said, I am the King of the Jews." Pilate refused. "What I have written, I have written." Rome executed the Messiah, and in doing so, it fulfilled exactly what the prophets had announced. Isaiah described a suffering servant who would be pierced for our transgressions. Psalm 22 detailed the thirst, the exposure, the mockery of the observers, and the division of garments by lot. Zechariah spoke of the one who would be pierced and for whom the house of David would mourn. Every detail of the crucifixion, from the soldiers casting dice for the clothes to the vinegar offered to the lips, was recorded in the Hebrew scriptures centuries before Rome even existed as an empire. The Romans were instruments. They did not know it. They did not need to know. 3 days later, the tomb was empty. The resurrection changed everything. The disciples who had fled at the hour of the arrest were now preaching openly in Jerusalem. Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, faced the Sanhedrin and declared that it was necessary to obey God rather than men. The community grew from 120 people gathered in an upper room to 3,000 converts on a single day of Pentecost. And then the expansion began. Here the Roman roads entered the scene in a decisive way. The Via Egnatia cut through Macedonia from east to west, connecting Byzantium to the Adriatic Sea. The Appian Way linked Rome to Brindisi. The Via Augusta crossed Hispania. These roads were paved with wide stones, drained by side ditches, punctuated by milestones every 1,000 paces. A determined traveler could cover 40 kilometers a day on foot, much more if using horses or carriages. The apostles used this infrastructure. Philip preached in Samaria and then baptized the Ethiopian eunuch on the road to Gaza. Peter traveled to Joppa and Caesarea. But no one took advantage of the Roman roads like Paul. Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee, a disciple of the Rabbi Gamaliel, a Roman citizen by birth. This combination was rare and powerful. As a Jew, he knew the scriptures in depth. As a Roman, he had legal rights that most early Christians did not possess. He could travel freely, appeal to higher courts, and demand trial in Rome if accused of a capital crime. After his conversion on the road to Damascus, Paul undertook 3 great missionary journeys that transformed Christianity from a Jewish sect into a universal faith. On the first journey, between 46 and 48 after Christ, he crossed Cyprus and Asia Minor. On the second, between 49 and 52, he crossed into Europe for the first time, founding churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and Corinth. On the third, between 53 and 57, he consolidated these communities and spent 3 years in Ephesus. Consider the distances. From Antioch to Corinth is more than 2,000 kilometers by land and sea. From Corinth to Rome, another 1,200. Paul traveled these routes multiple times, facing shipwrecks, robberies, imprisonments, floggings, and stonings. He himself listed his sufferings. 5 times he received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he suffered shipwreck. He spent a night and a day in the depths of the sea, all this to carry a message. and the message also traveled in writing. Paul's letters to the churches he founded form the largest part of the New Testament: Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians. These texts were copied, shared, read aloud in assemblies, and preserved as sacred scripture. The Roman postal system, although officially reserved for imperial correspondence, had routes and stations that facilitated any type of communication. The Pax Romana also made a difference. For more than 2 centuries, from 27 before Christ until 180 after Christ, the Mediterranean lived through a period of relative internal peace. The legions were at the borders, not policing the central provinces. Bandits existed, pirates occasionally attacked, but there were no large-scale wars interrupting trade and travel. A missionary could go from Jerusalem to Rome without crossing battlefronts. The common language also helped. Koine Greek, a simplified form of Classical Greek, functioned as the international language of the Eastern Mediterranean. Even in Rome, the elite spoke Greek. The New Testament was written entirely in this language, not in Hebrew or Aramaic. This meant that any educated person, from Alexandria to the Black Sea, could read the Gospels without translation. Rome provided the roads. Rome provided the peace. Rome provided the language. God used them all. But Rome also persecuted. The first imperial persecution happened under Nero in 64 after Christ. A great fire devastated Rome, destroying 10 of the 14 districts of the city. Rumors accused the emperor himself of having ordered the fire to rebuild the capital according to his grandiose plans. To deflect the guilt, Nero pointed to the Christians as scapegoats. The historian Tacitus, who had no sympathy for Christians, described what followed. Some were covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were turned into human torches to light the emperor's gardens during the night. According to tradition, Peter was crucified upside down in this persecution, considering himself unworthy to die in the same manner as his master. Paul, as a Roman citizen, had the right to a swifter death. He was beheaded. Nero's persecution was localized in Rome and lasted a short time, but it set a dangerous precedent. Being a Christian could cost one's life. Later persecutions varied in intensity. Domitian, at the end of the 1st century, demanded to be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and punished those who refused. Trajan established an ambiguous policy, not to hunt Christians actively, but to execute them if they were denounced and refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, permitted local persecutions in Gaul that produced martyrs like Blandina, a slave tortured repeatedly for days before finally being killed by beasts in the arena. The worst came with Decius and Diocletian. Decius, in 250, ordered all inhabitants of the empire to sacrifice to the gods and obtain certificates proving their compliance. Those who refused would be imprisoned, tortured, executed, or sent to forced labor in the mines. Many Christians yielded. Many others died. The persecution of Diocletian, beginning in 303, was the most systematic. Churches were demolished. Scriptures were burned. Clergy were arrested. The repression lasted for years and produced thousands of martyrs, especially in the East. Measure what it meant to be a Christian at that time. You could be denounced by an envious neighbor, a resentful slave, or a commercial competitor. If you were taken to court, the only way to escape was to burn incense before a statue of the emperor and curse the name of Christ. Many did this and later lived with the shame. Many others refused and paid with blood. The accounts of the martyrs impress by their serenity in the face of death. Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, was 86 years old when he was arrested. The proconsul tried to convince him to blaspheme against Christ to save his life. Polycarp replied, 86 years I have served him, and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme against my king who saved me? He was burned alive. According to witnesses, the fire formed a vault around him without consuming him, and he had to be killed with a sword. Ignatius of Antioch, taken to Rome to be devoured by beasts, wrote letters to the churches along the way, asking them not to try to save him. "I am God's wheat," he said, "and I shall be ground by the teeth of beasts to become the pure bread of Christ." Perpetua, a young noblewoman from Carthage, was arrested along with her slave Felicity. Perpetua had a baby she was nursing in prison. Her father begged repeatedly that she sacrifice to the gods to return home. She refused. In the arena, she faced first a wild cow and then the sword of a gladiator. She herself guided the blade to her throat when the executioner hesitated. These testimonies did not weaken the church, they strengthened it. Tertullian, writing at the end of the 2nd century, declared that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians. The courage of the persecuted impressed the pagans. What kind of faith produced people willing to die singing? What kind of hope made slaves face death with more dignity than emperors? The very spectacle of the executions, planned to intimidate, ended up converting spectators. And then came the turn that no one expected. Constantine. In 312, Constantine was marching against Maxentius to dispute control of the Western Empire. On the eve of the decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge, he had a vision. According to Eusebius, he saw a cross of light in the sky with the words, "With this sign you shall conquer." According to Lactantius, he dreamed that he should place the symbol of Christ on the shields of his soldiers. Constantine obeyed. He won. The following year, together with Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan, guaranteeing religious freedom to all inhabitants of the empire, including Christians. Confiscated properties were returned. Churches could be built openly. Clergy received tax exemptions. The emperor, who carried the title of Pontifex Maximus, high priest of Roman paganism, began to openly favor the faith that his predecessors had tried to exterminate. Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion. That would only happen decades later, with Theodosius. But he completely changed the relationship between the empire and the church. He financed the construction of basilicas in Rome, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 to resolve theological disputes. He intervened in ecclesiastical matters as if it were his imperial duty. Rome had crucified Christ. Rome had executed apostles. Rome had tortured martyrs for generations, and now Rome bowed. It was not a complete or instant conversion. Pagan customs persisted for centuries. The sincerity of Constantine's faith is debated to this day. He was only baptized on his deathbed. But the change was irreversible. The empire that had been the greatest persecutor became the greatest protector. Before closing, we need to return to an event that marked sacred history in a definitive way: the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. In 66 after Christ, Judea revolted against Rome. The reasons were multiple: crushing taxes, corrupt governors, religious tensions accumulated for decades. The Zealots, a radical group that advocated armed resistance, took control of Jerusalem and massacred the Roman garrison. Rome could not tolerate this challenge. Nero sent his best general Vespasian with 60,000 soldiers to crush the revolt. Vespasian advanced methodically through Galilee, destroying cities and crucifying rebels. In 68, when Nero died and civil war broke out in Rome, Vespasian paused the campaign. In 69, he was proclaimed emperor and departed for Rome, leaving his son Titus to conclude the conquest. Titus besieged Jerusalem at Passover in 70, when the city was crowded with pilgrims. It is estimated that more than 1 million people were inside the walls. The siege lasted 5 months. Famine became so extreme that mothers devoured their own children, fulfilling the curse of Deuteronomy. Jewish factions fought among themselves, even as the Romans tightened the siege. Josephus, who was present as an intermediary, relates scenes of indescribable horror. In August, the Romans breached the defenses of the Temple Mount. Titus, according to Josephus, wanted to preserve the sanctuary. But a soldier threw a torch through a window, and the fire spread rapidly. Herod's temple, the architectural marvel that had taken 80 years to build, was consumed by flames in a single day. The 9th of Aviv, the same date, according to Jewish tradition, on which the first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians, 656 years earlier. Josephus records that 1,100,000 people died during the siege and 97,000 were captured as slaves. The numbers may be exaggerated, but the scale of the catastrophe is undeniable. The temple was never rebuilt. The system of sacrifices ceased forever. Judaism had to reinvent itself completely, transforming from a religion centered on the temple into a religion centered on the synagogue and the study of the Torah. Jesus had prophesied exactly this. When his disciples admired the magnificent stones of Herod's temple, he said, "There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." When he wept over Jerusalem, he declared that her enemies would surround her, hem her in on every side, and dash her to the ground along with her children, because she did not recognize the time of her visitation. 40 years after the crucifixion, Rome executed the judgment. The Arch of Titus still stands in Rome today. It shows soldiers carrying the spoils of the temple, including the 7-branched menorah and the table of the showbread. It is a monument to Roman triumph. But it is also permanent testimony that the words of Jesus were fulfilled with verifiable historical precision. The Colosseum still stands. Its stones carry the blood of thousands of martyrs who preferred to die rather than deny the name of Christ. The emperors who ordered those executions became broken statues in museums. Their names appear in history books as curiosities of the past. But the name they tried to erase is pronounced today by more than 2 billion people on every continent. Rome wanted order through force. God brought transformation through sacrifice. The empire that considered itself eternal lasted 5 centuries in the West. The faith it persecuted has already crossed 20 centuries and continues to grow. The Roman legions no longer exist. The churches that were born under their shadow cover the earth. Every time you open a Bible divided into chapters and verses, every time you read the New Testament in your language, every time you enter a church built upon foundations that recall Roman basilicas, you are seeing the result of this history. The empire fell. The kingdom remains.